You ever look at the money in your wallet and feel like it's shrinking? Like that $20 bill just doesn't go as far as it did last year. Well, that's not just in your head. That's inflation. It's this quiet, invisible force that's constantly shaping our economy and our lives. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on it. What is it, really? And who's in charge of the whole thing?
I mean, this is the core question, right? It's that feeling you get at the grocery store or when you're filling up your car and you just realize your budget is stretched thinner and thinner. That loss of buying power, that's inflation in its most real, everyday form.
So, before we can even get into what causes it or how we fix it, we've got to be on the same page. We need to nail down what we're actually talking about. What is this thing that makes our hard-earned money feel less valuable over time?
Okay, so here's the official definition, but let's break it down. It's really a two-part story. First, the general level of prices for stuff goes up. We're not just talking about the price of gas, but pretty much everything across the board. And second, this is the part that really hits home. As all those prices go up, the power of your money goes down. Each dollar just buys you less. And if you want to see what happens when inflation goes completely off the rails, just look at this. This is from Germany after World War I. The price of a single egg went from a few pennies to 320 billion marks. No, that's not a typo. 320 billion. That is the terrifying power of hyperinflation, or money basically becomes worthless paper. So, what gets this ball rolling in the first place? Well, economists usually point to two main drivers. You can kind of think of them as two teams in an economic tug of war. On one side of the rope, you've got what's called demand pull inflation. On the other side, you've got cost push inflation. Demand pull is basically about too many people wanting to buy stuff, while cost push is all about it getting more expensive to make that stuff in the first place.
Let's start with demand pull. The easiest way to think about this is to picture the launch of a super popular new phone or gaming console. Everybody wants one, right? But there's a limited supply. So what happens? People start bidding up the price. Well, demand pull inflation is just that, but on a massive economy-wide scale. It's simply too much money chasing too few goods. Now, let's look at the other side of that coin, cost push. The classic example here is the oil crisis back in the 1970s. The price of oil, which is a key ingredient for, almost everything, suddenly shot through the roof. That made it way more expensive to produce and ship goods. So to protect their own bottom line, businesses had no choice but to pass those higher costs on to us, the consumers. They literally pushed the prices up. Okay, so if inflation is this big, invisible force, how in the world do economists actually track it? How do they, take the economy's temperature to see if it's running a fever? Turns out they've got some very specific tools for the job.
All right, so first up is the one you probably hear about the most, the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. It basically tracks a fixed shopping cart of things an average person buys, stuff like milk, gas, and rent. But the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, actually prefers a different one called the PCE. The big difference? The PCE is more flexible. If steak gets crazy expensive and people switch to buying more chicken, the PCE actually picks up on that change. And finally, there's the PPI, which tracks costs for the people making the stuff. You can think of it as an early warning system for inflation that might be coming down the pipeline. Now, you've probably heard news anchors talk about core inflation. What is that all about? It's actually pretty simple. Policymakers take out food and energy prices from the calculation. Why? Because those prices can swing around like crazy because of stuff like a bad harvest or a war overseas. By removing them, core inflation gives them a clearer, less jumpy picture of the real underlying trend. Okay, so we know what it is, what causes it, and how we measure it. This all leads to the really big question. What can we actually do about it? How do you go about taming this beast when it starts to get out of its cage? And this really is the multi-trillion-dollar question for the entire global economy. When inflation starts to run hot, it can really hurt people and damage the economy. So there has to be a way to fight back, right? Well, there is. The main responsibility here falls on a country's central bank. For the U.S., that's the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. And their primary weapon in this fight isn't super complicated. It's the ability to control interest rates, which is really just the cost of borrowing money. So here's how the playbook works. When the Fed raises interest rates, it gets more expensive for you to get a mortgage, for a business to get a loan to expand, for everything. This forces everyone, people and companies, to kind of pump the brakes on spending. That cools down the whole economy.
And the idea is that this will ease the pressure that was pushing prices up. But, and this is a big but, this medicine can have some serious side effects. Just look at what happened during the Great Inflation period in the US. By 1980, prices were just out of control. So the Fed chair at the time, Paul Volcker, stepped in and just cranked interest rates way up. And you know what? It worked. Inflation was eventually crushed. But it came at a huge price, a really deep recession and massive unemployment. It's a powerful lesson that taming inflation is often a painful process.
So after decades of trying different things, what's the goal now? Is it zero inflation? You might think so, but no, not quite. Most central banks around the world, including the Fed, have decided on a specific target: 2%. The whole idea is that a small, steady, predictable amount of inflation is actually a good thing for the economy.
And that leaves us with this really interesting final question. The goal isn't to get rid of inflation completely, but to keep it on a tight leash. Why? Because that 2% target is seen as the sweet spot. It's just enough to encourage people to spend and invest, which keeps the economy growing. But it's not so high that it eats away at the value of our savings. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act, and the success or failure of that act is what determines the real value of the money in your pocket.